conflictos territoriales y violencia de parte de la militarización que ha implementado el gobierno de Honduras en los campos. También hay mucha reacción social a la corrupción, a los diferentes procesos a los diferentes actos de corrupción que se han venido dando durante la pandemia, que han venido a reaccionar ante la sociedad y ha venido a implementar lo que son las protestas sociales y a raíz de ello ha habido mucha represión por parte del Estado ante estas protestas sociales, ¿verdad?, que se están dando. Asimismo, el Estado de Honduras todavía presenta un alto grado de interés por implementar como principal estrategia de desarrollo la profundización del modelo extractivo de los bienes naturales comunes en nuestras comunidades indígenas y campesinas, beneficiando solamente y exclusivamente a una élite política y económica. Esto viene a violentar lo que es el convenio 169 de la OIT y el derecho a nuestras comunidades indígenas y campesinas a poder participar, a tener una consulta libre, previa e informada en las comunidades. Tenemos muchos casos, CEPRODEC, y hacemos mucho mapeo a nivel nacional acerca de las concesiones mineras que se han otorgado, y tenemos también casos de que estas comunidades indígenas y campesinas no se dan cuenta que sus territorios ya han sido concesionados hasta la hora donde ya la maquinaria está en sus comunidades. ¿Y qué quiere decir? ¿Qué viene a traer esto a las comunidades? Viene a traer lo que son conflictos territoriales, conflictos con las empresas, conflictos con el Estado, y la mayor de ellos terminan en agresiones y también hasta podría terminar en muerte, ¿verdad? Que ya lo hemos visto y actualmente tenemos un contexto en que hay muchos defensores y defensoras que están siendo criminalizados por la lucha en los territorios, y también en nombre de CEPRODEC y de otras organizaciones de derechos humanos. Hemos denunciado, ¿verdad?, que en este contexto de la pandemia no hemos solicitado salvoconducto. Ya los tenemos, pero estuvimos casi 5 meses sin él, y teníamos muchos casos en los territorios de compañeras y compañeros que habían sido criminalizados, que tenían denuncias por agresiones de parte de los militares, y se nos hacía casi imposible poder movilizarnos a estas zonas. Entonces perdimos muchas audiencias, perdimos muchos procesos judiciales, y asimismo se les violentó el debido proceso a nuestros defensoras y defensores en las comunidades. Asimismo, también se implementó una nueva ley en las comunidades donde se sancionaba a miembros de la población en estas comunidades indígenas y campesinas a pagar una multa si no se tenía el equipo de bioseguridad. Esto también quiero resaltar que estas comunidades indígenas y campesinas viven en una situación precaria, y muchos de ellos no tienen el acceso a estos medios de bioseguridad, de equipo de bioseguridad, ni siquiera tienen un sistema, ni siquiera tienen clínicas cerca, o un sistema de salud un sistema de salud apropiado para ellos cerca de sus comunidades. Aparte de eso, también se quiso implementar una ley para sancionar y multar a las parteras indígenas, que son parte de su cosmovisión, que es parte también de su cultura ancestral, ¿verdad? Que estas parteras lo que hacen es ayudar a muchas mujeres, ¿verdad?, que no tienen el acceso para pagar un parto en un hospital, o inclusive hay comunidades muy lejanas que se tiene que pagar un alto monto de dinero para que una ambulancia llegue hasta esas comunidades, igual pagar un transporte que al final las comunidades no tienen, las mujeres no tienen esos recursos, ¿verdad?, para poder movilizarse. Asimismo, también es importante mencionar lo de la militarización en el campo. se está dando mucha violencia por parte de ellos en los campos y asimismo también hemos recomendado que se le dé una formación en derechos humanos y también en derechos humanos y de género a los operadores de justicia, ya que dentro del mecanismo de protección que tenemos aquí en Honduras, muchos de los policías que acompañan este proceso, este mecanismo, no cuentan con formación, ya que no saben ni siquiera qué es una medida cautelar. Y eso viene a traer muchos problemas porque incluso ellos mismos preguntan a nuestros líderes que tienen medidas cautelares qué es una medida cautelar. Entonces también es importante que se formen a operadores de justicia en temas de derechos humanos. Ahora mi compañera Felicita va a empezar le va a introducir, ¿verdad?, acerca del contexto en el que se está viviendo ahorita en Honduras, acerca de las violaciones que se están dando en los territorios. La población garífuna está en un alto, ahorita están en un ambiente de mucha tensión, ya que han desaparecido dos de nuestros compañeros que han estado en la defensa del territorio garífuna. Ellos están en la lucha para exigir al Estado de Honduras que aparezcan sus compañeros, y también tenemos un problema, un conflicto enorme con lo que es el caso de Guapinol. Entonces, mi compañera María Felicita López va a introducirles acerca de ese tema.
Tengan muy buenos días, mi nombre es María Felicita López, soy coordinadora de género dentro del Movimiento Independiente Indígena Lenca de La Paz, Honduras, Milpa, originaria del Departamento de La Paz, del municipio de Santa Elena. Exponerles un poquito, ¿verdad?, que la lucha de nosotras las mujeres viene en el Departamento de La Paz. Ahorita creo que han habido varios conflictos. Ahorita tenemos actualmente, luchamos primero, la organización nace por las concesiones hidroeléctricas dentro del Departamento de La Paz y dentro del municipio donde yo vivo, pero ahorita nos estamos enfrentando a la lucha también contra los permisos ambientales otorgados por el Instituto de Conservación Forestal, el ICF, los planes de manejo de explotación de madera dentro de los territorios, ¿verdad? Que solo en Santa Elena tenemos un plan de manejo que en una comunidad de Aguantequerique son 110 familias las afectadas, ¿verdad? Y es bastante preocupante porque estos planes de manejo han sido otorgados por el Instituto de Conservación Forestal, el ICF, sin consulta al pueblo y sin hacer estudio ambiental, ¿verdad? Ya que sabemos que el Departamento de La Paz no tiene bosques, son poquito los pulmones, les decimos nosotros, que son el pulmón de las fuentes de agua de los ríos, que aún poco han quedado, y hay varios planes de manejo. Solo en el Departamento de La Paz hay 26 planes de manejo, uno que está otorgado a Ban Rural.
Environmental management plans, some of which have been granted to different companies, and we see that the Honduran government is actually complicit in the in sacking, really, in just denuding the richness of nature because of their interest in economic.
De la OIT, ¿verdad? Y es bastante preocupante también porque como organizaciones estamos también en lucha y en defensa de todo lo que es la casa común, como ser el territorio, el agua, los ríos, el bosque y la tierra, y las semillas originarias y la medicina natural, ¿verdad? Porque también en el Congreso Nacional hay una ley que está...
And we have a right which is enshrined in national law. This is Decree 21 of 2012, which is against or covers the patents for seeds, traditional seeds, and which is supposed to protect our ancestral knowledge. This law flies in the face of our rights as Indigenous women and our constitutional and international protections. We are aware that the conflict that we are engaged in is a conflict which is waged against the rural communities by the government, and is a continuation of historical struggle, historical attacks on our people, which is affecting all of our way of life, including our relationship with the earth, our natural traditional medicines, and our cultural norms. Now, these companies are companies which are operating in a clandestine way. We are not aware of them. We're not aware of the plans or of the schemes that they have until they arrive in our territory with their heavy machinery. And so we're very concerned about the way that things are operating, because, well, we've got a new criminal code is being passed, is being instituted in Honduras, and we're concerned that we're going to be discriminated against as a result of this new criminal code, that we're going to be criminalized for our activities which are seeking to protect our ancestral rights. We're very concerned that we're going to be imprisoned as a result of our struggle. We've also got the situation of the pandemic. The truth is that the hired killers and the paramilitary organizations, they haven't gone into lockdown. They've continued to be active. Indeed, they've increased their activities during the pandemic, the period. We've had comrades, we had a comrade of ours murdered just last week called Arnold Joaquin Morazan, and we have other comrades who have been put into prison as a result of their activities in seeking to protect their territory. The public prosecutors have accused them of being carrying out subversive activities, but what they're actually doing is trying to protect the water sources, protect the rivers that give life to their communities. They are putting their lives at risk in order to defend their territory, defend the richness of the rivers, and defend their communities. In the face of these protests, the government is repressing and criminalizing us rather than responding to our concerns that we express. Several representatives of the state, including local mayors, for instance, are also working complicitly with the companies against the interests of the communities they're supposed to represent. And I think that as women, we are increasingly affected by the situation, because we're the ones who have to migrate to other countries, risking our lives in order to find a better life, because the experience of the poor and of poor women is that we are becoming increasingly affected by rampant poverty. Also, women are increasingly victims of violence, of gender-based violence, which has increased dramatically in the context of the of the pandemic. And despite the denunciations that we have made of the increasing attacks on women, nothing is being done. Indeed, the levels of violence have increased. We are demanding at the moment that there should be justice for our sister, indomitable defender of human rights, Berta Cáceres. We still don't have justice in the case of her murder. We, as Indigenous women, are going to continue fighting for to protect our communities and our territory, so that our territories are free of outside intervention that damages the very basis of our ancestral lives. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to add to this, just to mention that in the context of the pandemic, there have also been concessions have continued to be granted using virtual mechanisms which involve absolutely no consultation with the indigenous communities. And we wanted to reiterate that the struggle for the protection of territory and human rights continues in Honduras. The human rights organizations, we are continuing to carry out the accompaniment to accompany the different indigenous peoples and rural populations in Honduras in order to try to support them in their rejection of this extractive model that the Honduran state is implementing, is imposing on our indigenous communities. Thank you. We as indigenous women also entirely reject the government's recent implementation of the criminal code, or the new criminal code, because this means that that includes measures whereby victims of, or the people who are responsible for violence against women will not be punished, will go unpunished, and that is also lenient on drugs trafficking. if and we believe that it's very lenient on drugs traffickers, and we think that this is going to be something which will have a negative effect on our communities and on women as well, and we think that more blood will be shed as a result of the new criminal code. So many thanks to Andrea and Felicita for your words, and now we're going to pass to the next speaker.
No le escuchamos, Franklin. Creo que tiene el micrófono.
Franklin.
Hola. Sí, muy buenos días. Un gusto saludarles en esta hora de la mañana y muy contento por este espacio. Trataré de ser un poco breve por el tiempo, perdón, y manifestar que, bueno, ya son de generales conocidas, como decía en el inicio, soy Franklin Almendares, soy el secretario general y de Desarrollo Institucional de la Central Nacional Trabajadores del Campo, CNTC, una organización campesina reivindicativa que nació hace ya 36 años para luchar por los derechos de los campesinos, campesinas y por la defensa de la tierra y el territorio. Porque el hecho de ser campesino y campesina, defendemos esa tierra, defendemos el territorio y todos los recursos que en ese espacio donde están nuestras comunidades campesinas habitan. Honduras ha vivido prácticamente en crisis hace muchos años, pero en la actual crisis causada por el COVID-19, esto ha venido a crear una serie de políticas o de medidas económicas para fortalecer la economía o para incrementar el agro. Por eso me voy a enfocar en ese tema. Y me voy a hacerlo específicamente a un decreto que es altamente conflictivo y nocivo para el movimiento campesino e indígena a la vez, que es un decreto ejecutivo llamado PCM 030-2020, creado en pleno desarrollo de la pandemia, y es un decreto realmente que atenta contra la soberanía de los pueblos, contra la seguridad alimentaria de estas familias campesinas. Y decimos que es un decreto nocivo porque, ¿qué razón? Concesiona las tierras nacionales, ejidales, fiscales que están en poder de las familias campesinas e indígenas a la agroindustria nacional, a la agroindustria transnacional. No solo se la regala, no solo la concesiona por 20, 30 años, sino que le da favores fiscales, olvidando la verdadera implementación de la reforma agraria integral, que esto se traduce en lo que es una justicia social en el campo, donde garantice la alimentación del pueblo hondureño y que esto se traduzca en desarrollo humano para el país. Esa es la verdadera reforma agraria, pero con este PCM realmente es una vuelta, es un retroceso, es un proceso de contrarreforma agraria. Volviendo a una situación difícil, como lo decía, en el campo. Y esto sería como reconfigurar la política agraria en el país. ¿Qué significa con esto? La presencia en los territorios de agroindustria, de agroexportadores. ¿Y qué conlleva esta acción? Es el desplazamiento forzado. ¿Hola? Sí.
Sorry for interrupting. I'm just saying that there's a lot of echo. Can you reduce your volume a little bit to be able to hear a bit better?
Permita.
Right. Thank you. Hello?
Hola.
Hello?
¿Ahora?
Now now. Now is that better?
Sandra, have you
Hola.
have your mic on?
I do have my mic on. Can you not hear me?
They say they can't.
Can people hear me? Can people hear me? Because my mic is on. I don't know how else to do it. Can people hear? Can you hear me better now? Can you hear me better now? I don't know how to make it louder. Could you hear me before? Yeah.
Me escuchan y que tengo problema un poco con la señal, algo. Hola. Sí, no sé.
Okay, let's see.
También tengo un poco de problema con la señal a última hora. Entonces le decía que realmente este problema dificulta. Me quedaba ahí, no me escuchaba, porque configura la política agraria en el país, donde con esta acción la presencia de la agroindustria, del agroexportador en los territorios se convertirá en un problema grave realmente, porque esto vendrá a desplazar, vendrá a despojar de las tierras a las familias campesinas y por tal razón agudizará totalmente la crisis que hemos venido sufriendo por años en el campo. Hay cosas muy importantes que tenemos que saber, y ya lo mencionaba la compañera. Con estas medidas se ha militarizado totalmente el territorio, con intención de beneficiar a los empresarios, de beneficiar al poder económico y político del país. Durante la pandemia se han creado estos decretos que son altamente nocivos, como le decía, y que con esto aumentará la criminalización de las luchas territoriales. Con esto, ¿qué significa también? Una concentración total de la tierra y de la riqueza de nuestro país a beneficio de un grupo selectivo. Esto también trae consigo una enorme violación de los derechos humanos. El riesgo que sufren de forma directa o están sufriendo, y post pandemia lo que va a pasar, nuestras compañeras defensoras, que son los blancos perfectos en los territorios de los agresores, en este caso de los grupos armados, de civiles armados a cargo de los supuestos dueños de las tierras, de las transnacionales, de la policía, de los militares. Viene como una persecución total a nuestros campesinos y campesinas. Durante la pandemia hemos sido inmovilizados totalmente, y lo que es el sector empresarial, el sector del gobierno, no se ha parado, lo ha aprovechado para realmente hacer sus acciones en contra del pueblo hondureño. Esto va a incrementar una pobreza más grande en el campo, un déficit de la producción de alimentos, pero que una vez que entre en pleno desarrollo este decreto ejecutivo, estamos haciendo un balance y conocimiento de causa donde casi 400,000 pequeños productores van a dejar de producir. Y esta cantidad de compañeros y compañeras que producen alimenta casi a 2 millones de familias a nivel rural. Y esto ya no se va a poder porque viene el despojo total de sus tierras. Se incrementarán, los impactos ambientales serán más grandes, porque ahí se van a construir represas para riego, y al final el fondo de estos PCN no es fortalecer la agroindustria en el país, es apoderarse del territorio, porque ahí tenemos agua, bosques, ríos, etc. Vemos que una situación difícil que vive el país, militarizado totalmente, los verdaderos violadores de derechos humanos del gobierno, Un gobierno que ha sido criticado y se ha hecho acciones sociales exigiendo respuesta sobre las miles y miles de millones de dólares que se han utilizado en el marco de la pandemia para resolver la problemática sanitaria, la problemática alimentaria, y en ningún momento han dado ninguna respuesta. Un gobierno que está envuelto en la corrupción, en el narcotráfico. Eso es algo realmente grave porque, ya decía la compañera Felicita, con la implementación, la aprobación del nuevo Código Penal, realmente penaliza o criminaliza nuestras luchas. Diríamos que vivimos en un país complicado, Honduras, muy lindo, por cierto, pero donde la tarea de defensor de la tierra y el territorio, defensor de los bienes comunes de la naturaleza, es un peligro. Solo mencionarle un dato muy general, en lo que vamos de marzo a octubre, nuestra organización CNTC, solo por la defensa de las tierras que viven la familia campesina por muchos años, ya tenemos 341 familias que han sido criminalizadas y que ahorita están viviendo en alto riesgo porque han sido despojadas de sus tierras, de otros líderes han sido amenazadas. ¿Y por quién? Por estos entes represores del Estado y por paramilitares. ¿Qué significa? Una crisis alta en el campo en plena pandemia. Nosotros hemos dicho qué va a pasar post pandemia, y espero que también ante estos PCMs que ha creado, que ha declarado el gobierno, nos hemos manifestado en contra, interponiendo recursos ante la Corte para que nos... ¿Sí?
Las personas que están
so anybody who's getting the translation at the moment, then if you just have the English without any of the Spanish in the background to maybe be able to do that and see if that makes it any better. Can also people put in the chat if they're hearing it in
full? Yo estaba concluyendo diciéndole que ante esta embestida, ante estas nuevas leyes creadas desde el Ejecutivo, nos hemos manifestado en contra, a través de estar interponiendo recursos entre la Corte para poder de una forma llevar esa tranquilidad a nuestros campesinos y campesinas, donde si se implementan totalmente estos decretos,
as peasant communities to silent now. I can't hear anything now.
Franklin, ahora no la escuchamos. Creo que se ha quitado el micrófono. Ahorita sí.
Sí, es automáticamente que se me quita, no sé qué pasa. Es que estoy en una zona rural también. Concluye diciendo esto, era lo último, que nos estamos manifestando
Hola Franklin, ¿nos escucha? Bueno, creo que se ha bloqueado la conexión. Los demás...
I think his connection has gone. So while we're waiting for him to come back...
While we're waiting for Franklin, so what we were going to do was to give people an opportunity to ask questions and to make comments that people can ask to the Honduran human rights defenders and community representatives that we've listened to, that we've already heard from. So if you could raise your hands in the participants window, and then we'll be able to take your questions from you.
Okay, so if there aren't any questions, then no worries. We'll have another space for questions at the end. So if you've got any more questions, then we will be able to deal with any questions you've got then. So now let's give the floor to Andrea Nuila from FIAN International. Thank you. I'll share my screen now. Okay, so I hope you can see it properly. Oh, but you can see, yeah, can you see it? Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. So firstly, I want to just say thank you to PBI for inviting me to speak here today. Particularly as a Honduran, thank you for creating and facilitating this space for exchanging experiences with our comrades who are doing such wonderful work in Honduras. It's very special and close to me. I know I don't have very much time, so I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. I would just like to say briefly, I would just like to talk about the declaration, but we can go into that further later if we in the question and answer section of the webinar. So the Declaration of Peasant Rights and Other People Working in Rural Areas, as you all know, is a declaration that was adopted in 2018 by the UN General Assembly. But I think one of the most important things is to emphasize that the Declaration for Peasant Rights isn't an instrument that is used in the same way as the international instruments that are used within the universal system of human rights, because this declaration has about a 15-year political history. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, but it was approximately, it took about 15 years to discuss amongst different members and different peasant organizations related to the La Via Campesina, and this was done on an international level. And then it's interesting to think, and they talked a lot about what would be the rights that should be reflected or could be reflected or could properly reflect peasant needs. And they were able to come into the universal human rights system in that way. So this system before had been a bit quite conservative relating to peasant rights up to then. So in 2012, the process for human rights it was started in the UN system, and it was strongly supported by Evo Morales in Bolivia. So I wanted to mention that first, and then in 2018, as I was saying, the declaration was approved by the United Nations General Assembly. I think 191 voted in favor, 8 against, and sort of 52 abstained. So you can see 120 in favor, but at the time that this photo was taken, China hadn't voted, so no, 121, sorry. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, the 27 states voted for, Guatemala voted against. It was quite a difficult role with the ambassador and the US ambassador dealing with the interventions during the negotiations. And Honduras wasn't part of the discussions, it was absent from the discussions relating to human rights And when we're in the General Assembly in New York, Honduras was completely absent from the negotiations. And so therefore you can see there that they abstained from voting in favor of the declaration. So what I wanted to stress in the little time that we have, 3 important aspects of the declaration. I guess that many of you already know about it, but to just stress one is the big weight that the declaration has in the fact that it recognizes them as rights holders, and it's quite a wide-reaching definition. So in the declaration they're understood as subjects, not just as the campesina, but the different identities that are part of rural communities. So it's quite a wide-reaching definition. So, and they don't need to identify as indigenous, or they do or not. So, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has also ruled recently about the recognition of Afro-descendant communities as well within these issues. In international human rights law, peasants before didn't have their own legal instrument. So this is quite important, and it's important to stress this. So now it's quite a wide-reaching declaration. It's not just people who work on the land. We're also talking about agricultural migrants, pastors, women, livestock, people who work with livestock. And so all of these people who are in this change of food production, people who make the nets for going to fish, or making the food for the peasants who go to work.
El segundo elemento es la promoción y la protección de los intereses colectivos, y es que en la opinión de FIAN Internacional y de varias organizaciones, esta declaración marca un hito histórico dentro de la historia.
It was a historic moment in international law, because for the first time, it's the first time that the subjective rights that were recognized in civil and political policies. So rights are not just individually exercised, but they can be collectively exerted, particularly with land. Sometimes it can only be, these rights can only be exercised collectively. So that was incredibly important. It could be quite obvious for many people who work the land, but for many rural communities it wasn't obvious when there's people who are taking and making decisions in relation to this. So yeah, it's an important point there. So it's a big step forward to recognize the collective interest, particularly to land, and also the various recognition of rights for peasants. The declaration sets out various different rights and duties of the state. So they're reflected. It's a reflection of the specific rights for peasants that are reflected in other human rights instruments. So the rights of peasant women or who work in rural areas. So there's related to the CEDAW Convention. That is specifically related, but this is specifically related to peasant women, not just women overall, and also the monitoring of human rights. It's also an interesting document to look at, because it's much more advanced in many ways than what was achieved for Article 4 in the Declaration. So various rights are recognized. So civil and political rights, the freedom of expression, and all of these sorts of issues that simply reflect other freedoms that were recognized in other international human rights instruments.
Ciertos derechos que,
but there are various rights that are more specific, that specifically respond to the realities of peasant communities. So here I'm talking about the recognition of food sovereignty as a right, the rights to land, the right to the protection of the environment, the right to seeds, the right to measures relating to protecting biodiversity, the right to participation, and these sorts of rights that are more specific to the reality of peasant communities. So I'm running out of time now, but I just want to mention that when we're talking about rights to land, there are various aspects that are very specific in this declaration. One, that you've got the access and use and manage of the land. So both on an individual and collective level, and to ensure that they that they can manage this collectively, not just individually, and to recognize customary tenure systems and the importance. Yeah, so it includes the customary land tenure systems, even if they are not already recognized by the law. And so this is one of the most interesting articles that we have to face when we look at the reality. Within the international market system, with the transactions of land, which is completely inaccessible for the majority of peasants. And so there are various obligations for the state. So having access and use to the land, the redistribution of land, the restitution of land and natural resources. So I had included a part about relating to obligations related to the consultation, which wasn't the main focus of the declaration. But there is also an explicit obligation for states to consult in good faith with peasant communities and people working in rural communities to avoid all the things that Felicita and Andrea are talking about. So yeah, when when the machines turn up and peasant communities realize that their lands are gone when it's already started. And so at the moment, capitalism globally is what determines the means of production and the way that societies are developing. It's a world in which land, all of the riches of the world is being very concentrated in very few hands. So you can see, I'm not sure if you can see it very well. So 81% of the land in Latin America is in very few hands, basically. So this is a huge challenge. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about the implementation, but I just want to mention that the declaration should be used as a political reference to make sure that these interests can be crystallized in rights. It also provides a possibility to challenge the models that exist at the moment relating to international trade. So that's everything. Thank you.
Bueno, many thanks for that presentation and also for the visual aids that you provided. So now I'm going to pass the word to Michel Soufferet of Souterrain so that she can also speak. Many thanks for giving me the opportunity to take part in this meeting. I feel really very sad to hear that the situation in Honduras remains so terrible. We knew we knew that this was the case, but to hear it directly spoken about like this well, I'm just really sorry. I'm going to talk about the work that we do in Switzerland with the declaration, with the UN declaration. The situation in Switzerland is so different from the situation that you are describing for Honduras. I'm going to be as quick as I can with my presentation. So it'll possibly help you to get a few ideas that might be able to nourish the discussion and conversation that we have at the end of this event. So the Swiss situation, as I've said, is very different. Our state has actively supported the negotiation process of the declaration, and Switzerland voted in favor of the declaration. There's another aspect which it's also important to point out in the Swiss context, which is that during all of the negotiation period, the period of negotiation of the declaration, we worked very closely with Swiss NGOs. And this has enabled us to develop a trusting relationship and to develop a shared strategic vision, for instance, in terms of the advocacy activities. So these NGOs that we call Friends of the Declaration brings together NGOs that were involved in the negotiation, the CITIM, the Geneva Academy, Bread for the World, and others. So all of these...
This call may be recorded. Welcome to Bank of America Claim Services.
Did you hear someone was speaking there? Yes, I think somebody put their microphone on by mistake. So carry on, please, Andrea. So the advocacy work for us has to do with, or must be carried out on different levels. We are a confederation of Swiss trade unions, and so we need to operate at the level of our trade union members. It's very difficult for them to see how the declaration might be of use to them, being industrial. So we carried out a series of analyses looking at the food products, the agricultural products that are important to their lives. We looked at questions of where the agricultural products, where the meat, where the vegetables come from. And this was the way that we sought to show them the importance of these questions that we're talking about. These chains of value added that they are a part of and which are not actually conducive or are inconsistent with the terms of the declaration. So we sought to carry out advocacy activities in that way. In order to respond to what Andrea was saying, there are articles that defend and support rights, but much more important, or also equally important, are the duties of states. So we work very determinedly with the states, trying to argue for the duties that they as states have in terms of the declaration. It's also true that in Switzerland, the peasant population is very small, less than 3% of the population. And so in order to build up support, to make our voice stronger, we work with young people, we work on climate activists, in order to, in their demonstrations that they carry out, their mass actions. So in order to try to increase and multiply the voices that are...
de las políticas exteriores de Suiza, y allá trabajan muy fuerte las ONGs que trabajan en cooperación de desarrollo. Pedimos un estudio sobre las políticas exteriores de nuestro gobierno en relación con la UNDROP. Entonces, es un análisis del sistema agrícola y alimentario global, pero focalizamos sobre los tratados comerciales, tratados de libre comercio, la política de cooperación internacional de Suiza, los derechos, el derecho a las semillas y todas las cadenas internacionales de valor.
Of justice in access to seeds, against the monopolizing of seed materials, seeds. So we're doing all of this work, and this has helped us to develop a series of recommendations that we connect to or that we link with the articles of the declaration. So all of this has been at the root of the activities that we carry out. And we have presented the fruits of this work to the different government departments with the support of Bruno, who's going to be talking later, or working with Bruno, who's going to be talking later. We've talked to different ministries, the agriculture, industry ministry, the ministry responsible for intellectual property, etc. So we've tried to touch or have contact with, advocate with all of the different relevant ministries in the Swiss government. And we're seeking to convince them that the way things are organized at the moment, it is not working, and that we need to have a change, and we need to have a rapid change in the way that the international agricultural system is organized. All of us, we argue, are involved in the answers. We all have a role to play. So here, in terms of Swiss foreign policy, I think you all know very well that Switzerland is the country that is where many very irresponsible, ugly transnational companies are headquartered. You all know this very well, that we have a lot of very troubling companies are domiciled in Switzerland that operate in Honduras and that are carrying out activities that are very damaging in Honduras and in other countries across Latin America. So it's very important that Switzerland should support the declaration, should implement the declaration. And if it does do this, we think that in that way it will be able to, we want it, our aspiration is that Switzerland should play a leading role, should be an example to the world in the way that foreign policy should be organized around the principles of the declaration. So I couldn't go into too much detail, but what I've tried to do is to provide you a brief demonstration of the strategy that we follow in order to try to organize our advocacy around the declaration. Thank you very much for the attention that you have offered me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, for your presentation. So now we're going to pass the floor to the last speaker, so Benjamin Müller, who, as Michelle has said, is the deputy head of the Human Rights Policy section in the Human Security Division in Switzerland at the Foreign Ministry. Can you hear me? Yeah. That's great. So good afternoon. Good morning in Honduras and good afternoon to everybody here in Switzerland and the rest of Europe. Thank you to the people who have organized the webinar and to all of the speakers for your presentations and for inviting me to share Switzerland's experience with the Declaration of Peasants' Rights, what we call it, called UN DROP. I'm Benny Müller. I work in the Foreign Ministry in Switzerland. And as you know, to diplomats, they send diplomats off to different countries to work, and I was sent in 2014 to leave Indonesia, where I was, to form part of the team that defends the positions of Switzerland relating to human rights in Geneva. And one of the things that they got me to do in Geneva was put in the negotiation team on Switzerland's position in around the declaration. So in the Switzerland government, Swiss government, said, so we want to be constrictive in these negotiations. This was something that came out of the parliament. That was kind of like the basis of our participation. What we wanted to do, or what we tried to do, were two things. Firstly,
países que estuvieron detrás de la iniciativa, como Bolivia, y países que más bien tenían dudas, ¿no? O reservas sobre la propuesta. Es decir, queríamos contribuir a una dinámica positiva en esta negociación que llevó finalmente varios años, ¿no es cierto? Y segundo, tratábamos de contribuir con...
Try to provide concrete proposals to try to improve the text or to go deeper into various issues, such as we're having seminars relating to rights to land or to seeds. This is outside the negotiations rooms to ensure that people could expand their knowledge and to discuss key aspects of the declaration with a little bit more time and to go deeper into these issues. As Michel Choufret has mentioned, Switzerland did vote in favor of the declaration in the end, which is, well, unfortunately, it wasn't the case for many industrialized countries. So before talking about the implementation of the declaration by Switzerland, I wanted to briefly share three different thoughts relating to the question of how the declaration can be useful, specific reasons or ways that it can be useful. We know the UNDROP, it's not a legally binding instrument. It's what they call soft law instrument. So there are at least three elements to consider in how, when we're thinking about how this declaration can be useful. So firstly, the courts can use the declaration to interpret the law, apply it and make it work in binding national law. So if we think about development of extractive industry, I've just heard about various testimonies that there are lots of processes and disputes in Honduras relating to this issue. So I would say that a judge could refer to, I think it's point 2 in the declaration that relates to the evaluation of environmental impact on land. And this is also relating to the ILO Convention 169 related to indigenous peoples' rights, or in places where indigenous people have issues in exercising their rights. They're just because people aren't the state doesn't the government doesn't recognize them as indigenous, then the fact that you're having the declaration of peasants can help these people to have their rights recognized.
De utilizar la declaración, de mi punto de vista que ofrezco aquí, es una declaración que siempre puede inspirar leyes nacionales, ¿no? O regionales. Hemos visto eso con la declaración sobre pueblos indígenas que...
In the Indigenous Peoples Declaration, it has been used as a basis in which certain countries have then adopted binding law within their national legislation that's come off the basis of these declarations. And thirdly, in many cases, with specific changes for peasants' lives, so the results of state policy, and these policies don't depend necessarily on law. So the declaration, despite the fact that it's not binding, it can influence public policy. It can be used to propose to make proposals to the government to develop certain sorts of policies or cooperation policies or policies related to international organizations or companies to take peasant rights into account in developing these policies. So implementation in Switzerland, I'll talk about this very briefly. So people who work and live in rural areas are crucial, as we know. Switzerland is committed both internationally and nationally to develop small-scale agricultural. So in Switzerland, so current agriculture is very high technology. It's very difficult to compare it to the challenges that people like peasants face in a country like Honduras. But there are some small-scale farmers. So in Switzerland, we had an agricultural law that came in 1999, and there's information about sustainable agriculture there. And so sustainability was talking about the environment, social security, and the economy. And we can see here now with climate change, the crises that are coming, that agriculture is going through a very difficult time, particularly, and also in Switzerland. There are problems, there are serious problems, there's very high costs, there's a lot of competition, particularly from outside the country, and so how can we reflect that in our policies in Switzerland and in our legal framework? So we need to be coherent in our actions, both within Switzerland and internationally. And so we've got this challenge. We want to maintain an agricultural system that is competitive economically, but that also respects the rights of small-scale farmers and also that respects the environment. But the debate I think that the declaration, from my point of view, the declaration can be used to inform this debate and this difficult debate. So we've got Michel Chirclet, sent out a study that identified various areas that need improvement in our foreign policy, like Swiss foreign policy. COSUDE, which is the Swiss Corporation for Development.
Un drop puede como que servir de base o de inspiración para programas, ¿no?, de desarrollo rural. Y quisiera concluir mi intervención con dos ejemplos concretos de trabajo de la COSUDE en Honduras. El uno es sobre la defensa del territorio en la región del Golfo de Fonseca, como ustedes saben mucho mejor que yo, que es una zona de conflictividad social y de acaparamiento de tierras y la instalación de la industria extractiva, etc. Entonces, en ese contexto, a partir de 2016, la COSUDE, la Cooperación Suiza para el Desarrollo, lanzó el programa Fortalecimiento de Derechos Humanos y Auditoría Social, conformado por 5 organizaciones de sociedad civil y el PNUD. Desde el programa se brinda acompañamiento político, organizativo y legal a las comunidades, a movimientos sociales y a organizaciones que trabajan por la defensa del territorio y el acceso a los recursos naturales. También brindándoles asesoría y fortaleciendo sus capacidades de organización, de incidencia y de manejo de las instancias nacionales, regionales y universales de protección de derechos humanos. Y el segundo proyecto es sobre el desarrollo económico y el acceso a la tierra. Los pueblos Miskitu, Pech, Tahuasca y Garífuna, estoy seguro que pronuncié mal esas palabras, pero de Garífuna ya hemos estado escuchando durante este debate. Han habitado ancestralmente, ¿no?, la región de Mosquitia, y a pesar de los títulos de propiedad otorgados a su favor, siguen enfrentando la reducción sistemática de sus territorios ancestrales y el deterioro ambiental en su región. Entonces, COSUDE facilita el proceso de incidencia para que el gobierno decretara en el año pasado un decreto ejecutivo que crea la Comisión Interinstitucional de Saneamiento y Protección de los Territorios y Recursos Naturales de esa región hondureña. Entonces, uno de los retos, obviamente, es la débil institucionalidad pública y el reducido presupuesto también del Instituto Nacional Agrario, que es el ente líder, tengo entendido, para el proceso de saneamiento. Entonces, para concluir, Suiza se comprometió a trabajar para la aplicación de un drop de esta declaración en el país y también mediante nuestro compromiso internacional. Esperamos continuar nuestra colaboración con los estados y también con las ONGs asociadas de diferentes regiones del mundo para hacer, digamos, de este documento que es papel, ¿no? Para hacer de esto una realidad y una contribución para mejorar realmente las condiciones de vida de los y las campesinos. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Benjamin.
Thank you very much, Benjamin Müller, for your presentation, and to everybody else who has worked on it and who today have shared their perspective today. We've still got some minutes left for questions, so I'm going to open up the floor now for contributions. I'll just remind you that you can raise your hand using the raise hand button. And if we call on you, if you could say who the question is for, that would be very helpful. Thank you. So I'd like to ask a question. I'm Katia Ayabia from PBI. I don't have a camera, I'm sorry. I wanted to hear from the Honduran comrades, from Andrea and Teresita. How do you see, what possibilities do you see of using the declaration in support of your struggle? I don't know if Andrea, if you've heard the question. Yes. Well, for me, it would be a very important declaration because the men and women, peasants and indigenous, we have the same struggles in our territories and we have the same rights. And that's really what I'd like to say. Thank you very much, Teresita, for your answer. I don't know if we have any more questions.
Bueno, si no, tiene más preguntas, soy yo. Giovanna, de PBI Honduras.
So this is Giovanna from PBI Honduras. Many thanks to everybody. My question is more just an expression of concern, really, fruit of the accompaniment that we carry out of organizations in Honduras. It's a shame that that Katia, I think, has lost contact and wasn't. Oh, Franklin hasn't been able to continue taking part, but we will make sure that he gets the information about how the webinar finished. Our presence in Honduras and our in this context of the pandemic, what we're observing is situations where we're seeing situations of stress, is what we call them, where as a new framework of action, a new context in which our work takes place. And this is something which Franklin mentioned, and Andrea has also mentioned, and Teresita, which is that the conditions under which they are operating are much more stressful now. So the communities organize themselves, and they're now needing to organize in order to respond to a health crisis, as well as seeking to defend their territory, from which there have always been violent attempts to dislodge them. So this is the situation now with the added problem of the pandemic, where these illegal evictions from their land are occurring, but where it's more difficult to oppose them. So my question, given this situation, is more a comment, really. But perhaps I think that Andrea has spoken about, and Benjamin as well. I mean, different articles of the declaration have been mentioned. 5.2 in particular, Benjamin mentioned. I would talk about Article 5.1, which emphasizes in particular access to natural resources for the communities, in order to guarantee that they have access to resources that are necessary for them to continue their lives. So in a context such as the one that is being faced, where the levels, where the index, where the figures are suggesting increased levels of poverty, my question in this would be, how then can the declaration, in these new circumstances, Michel talked about how the declaration could be an example for Europe. How could Switzerland or others, the movement for international cooperation, how could it, what other actions could they take in order to raise the profile of the declaration in such a complicated scenario, such a difficult scenario as the one that has been described? So I'll leave it to that. So any kind of comment on what I've just said would be very welcome. Thank you.
No sé si puedo tomar la palabra.
I don't know if anyone else would like to say something. Yeah, well, many thanks. I'd say, well, there isn't really a response to that. It's not a binding legal document. Unfortunately, it's not a question of law, but a question of a process. So what can we do to confront the situation that you've described? Well, I would say that as well as including the declaration and referring to it in all of the legal actions that we carry out in Honduras, I would see it as a resource that we can use in order to try to continue to fight against the privatization process. It can be used in amicus briefs that lawyers can produce in order to support the lawyers operating in Honduras. But I would say that the likely response of the authorities in Honduras is going to be to ignore these representations that we make, but not for that should we stop using it. I would say that in Honduras, even though I think it won't necessarily be that useful to us in Honduras, I wouldn't say I wouldn't I don't think it's going to be adhered to particularly or responded to particularly positively in Honduras, but that doesn't stop other states using it. Other states who are able to exercise a degree of political pressure on Honduras based on the terms of the declaration, I think it could be used in their actions. So I would urge the European Union to refer to the declaration. The European Union does play an important role, does have the ear of have a certain influence that it can exert over the Honduran authorities. So I would urge the European Union to use the UNDROP in order to, I would urge the European Union governments to refer to UNDROP in all of their relations with the Honduran government, so that they could demand also or apply pressure so that all of the activities of companies that come from those countries also fulfill and comply with the terms of UNDROP. So I would say that that's one of the ways in which it could be used. The other thing is that I'd say there's a certain amount of political pressure that can be applied as well, moral pressure that can be applied by the UN. I remember, for instance, the UN Human Rights Office in Honduras, which has raised the profile of land rights. Land rights are now the rights that are enshrined or that are mentioned in the UNDROP are now a part of the framework of the human rights human rights mechanisms. So there is now a requirement of human rights organizations, but also of governments, to monitor the situation of the rights to access to land that now needs to be monitored as a part of the human rights mechanisms. Not so it's raised the stakes. It's made it more possible to argue for land and territorial rights within the context of the Universal Human Rights Framework. And I would say that we need to use the rights that are enshrined in that are mentioned in the declaration, and use those in order to continue with the advocacy that is carried out on the against or in relation to Honduras. And this includes the extraterritorial obligations of the companies that are operating in Honduras. Would anybody else like to respond to what Yoba has said? Yes, if you allow me to. Thank you very much also for the comment.
Mucho no se acaba, ¿no? Y cada actor tiene que seguir jugando su rol, su papel, ¿no? Tanto los estados como la sociedad civil y todos los implicados. Lo que quisiera mencionar es que una oportunidad que veo en el caso de Honduras también próximamente es el EPU, ¿no? El examen periódico universal de Honduras, que tiene lugar en noviembre, me parece, y se pueden obviamente también formular recomendaciones. O sea, en ese proceso cada estado hace recomendaciones a Honduras, ¿no? Sobre derechos humanos y cómo mejorar la situación. Entonces obviamente se puede utilizar, ¿no? Esta declaración y decir o pedir a Honduras que cumpla con los diferentes artículos, por ejemplo el artículo 5.1 y los otros también. Solo esa sugerencia también. Y nosotros, por ejemplo, como Suiza, también estamos siempre abiertos a sugerencias, ¿no? Por parte de la sociedad civil de qué recomendar a Honduras.
Muchas gracias, Benjamín. No sé si hay algún comentario más finales siempre relacionado con las preguntas. Otra, podemos creo tomar la última pregunta, y si no ya los tiempos se nos están apretando un poquito.
But if we've got a last question or not, if not, we'll start to close. Okay, oh, sorry. I do have one last question if nobody else is going to come forward. Yeah, go for it. I would like to know from Michelle. The link of the declaration within the framework of the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, to understand a bit better the link that's being made between the declaration and the Human Rights Council there. Okay. I'm not, so what work do we do now the declaration has been accepted? And like, how do we work with the Human Rights Council? Is that what you want to know? Yes, sorry. I was just clarifying that. Okay. So now we do it through the Friends of the Declaration of Peasants' Rights organization or association. So often what we ask Benjamin Muller to give us ideas, but the main idea behind it from the Via Campesina is to be able to implement UN drop in all of the different instruments within the UN. So within the Human Rights Council, we do that. So we've got the for the UPR, the periodic review, the UPR that Benjamin was talking about just before, to ensure that this takes into account the demands that are made in the declaration, and also with the special rapporteur for the rights to development in the FAO, do you know what I mean? The Food and Agriculture Organization. Benjamin, can you help? How do you say it in Spanish?
La FAO.
Yeah, the FAO. Yeah. Sorry, my brain had a blank. So really, what we work is to mainstream and to make sure that the declaration actually is included in all of the instruments. So it's reflected in all of these instruments, and it's taken into account in the different decision platforms within the UN. So that's it. Have I answered the question? Yes, thank you. Thank you. No worries. Okay, thank you, Michelle. I don't know if there's any final comment. Okay, if not, as I said, then we'll close because unfortunately the time is running out. I just want to say thank you to everybody who's participated today. I think it's a very interesting space, and it's been very important to have this space to share and to get to know more about the Honduran reality, particularly considering the last few months. It was great to be able to listen to the testimony from our comrades, defenders of human rights of the land and territory in Honduras, and the horrible things that they're having to face in these months, particularly in these months of in the crisis of COVID-19, but also generally. And so I've got this, and also to understand more about the legislative framework and the concerning advances or developments that they are undertaking there relating to access to land and also the communities, peasant and indigenous communities, which is related to natural resources and that are in their territories and their land. Also important to remember that under international law, as our speakers have reminded us, indigenous peoples are covered by the Convention 169 of the ILO. They are legally entitled to have a free, prior and informed consent. So thank you so much to our women human rights defenders who have talked about their challenges that they face and the risks that they run, particularly women who are in rural areas of the country, particularly this in this particularly important role that they play, and seeing how we can legitimize and better implement this piece of paper, particularly in Honduras, where it has such a large, high rate of violence against women. And so thank you for the accompaniment with CNTC, the National Office for Farm Workers in Honduras, because we would like to also highlight the importance of the declaration for the rights of peasants that we've talked about today, and find ways of better promote and respect it, and find ways to make sure that they respect these the articles included within it, particularly related to access of land and the respect of customary land tenure systems. So thank you again to everybody from Honduras, from Europe, anybody from anywhere around in the world. So people in Central America, then. So good morning, goodbye, and good evening, good afternoon to everybody. So bye-bye.
Gracias.
Hasta luego, muchas gracias.
Hasta luego, muchas gracias.
Gracias por el espacio.
Hasta luego.
Gusto.
Gracias.
Gracias, chao.
Chao, chao.